So let's turn our attention now to involuntary turnover. Specifically, that means the employee has no control over whether or not they are asked to leave the company for a variety of reasons. And there are three major reasons why somebody will be discharged from the company. It could be because they are a poor performer, in which case then the organization agrees that this person is not ever going to be able to do the job that they were hired for. There aren't other positions available for them where they may be more qualified and able to do the job, so they are let go for that reason. It also could be for disciplinary reasons. And so an employee that continues to violate company policies, engages in illegal or unethical behavior, will also get dismissed from the organization. So it is involuntary on their part. Lastly, can be a layoff. And the layoff is largely because of economic or strategic reasons where they no longer are as productive. The division or department is no longer that productive, or the job that that person's doing is being eliminated. And so if that's the case, then we don't need to have people in those positions. And so we don't just lay off one person. We often lay off a department or a handful of people across the board. Particularly for economic reasons, we try to do more with less. I'm not saying that that's a wise choice, but it is a choice nonetheless that some organizations will make. So they will engage in the separation of the employee simply because economic reasons or, strategy-wise, we're not going to do this. We're not going to make this product or service anymore, so we don't need the people doing that job anymore. In circumstances where someone is laid off, they do have the right to recall those employees if positions become available. Often, people don't go back simply because they have to get another job, and by the time new positions are available, they may have already secured another job. But in some circumstances, you'll find that employees may return if a position becomes available for them. So this is not an uncommon practice out there. And there are all sorts of costs attached to this, right? Because when we let go of somebody, whether it's because of poor performance or disciplinary issues, we have to replace them. And that's going to cost us money to recruit, hire, train, and get them up to speed in 6 months' time. So there's a cost attached there. And of course, in any circumstance, if somebody is a good worker, someone is a smart person and has knowledge, but obviously engaged in an unethical behavior, while you are glad to get rid of them because of the unethical behavior or the illegal behavior, you still lose institutional knowledge that this individual had. Yes, you do need to let them go, but there are still information that we should be aware of. Layoffs, again, also, we're losing institutional knowledge. And while we might argue we don't need them, we have more people than we need, still it's problematic because we have individuals who don't, we have all the knowledge that these individuals have that they've been let go, and that can leave us absent information. And I've heard of circumstances, and this happened quite often, right, where they say, oh, we're going to let people go, we're going to lay them off, and then they turn around and go, oops, we really need them, and they hire them back, or they hire them back as consultants instead at a much higher rate. So who the heck knows what is the right choice here? But it's important to be very strategic when we are doing involuntary turnover, and because Wall Street knows when we're not doing things the right way. They understand, and they can assess, analysts can assess whether or not this is a layoff based on, basic accounting functions, right? If we decrease expenses, it increases profitability without it being strategic in nature. We need to know who we're laying off, why we're laying them off, how is that going to impact the bottom line, how is it not going to hurt us in the long run. And following up on the discussion about the costs, there are costs for dismissal. There's lawsuits, there's negativity, there's the potential for sabotage. There could be tensions, arguments, people basically not stepping up to the plate to be the kind of performer that they need to be, so we lose productivity there. There's also, the risks of not letting somebody go, because then we end up with a toxic environment and people are more likely to quit. That's the voluntary turnover time. They're more likely to engage in harassment, which then opens us up to lawsuits because we are not managing a toxic work environment. We are obligated to manage toxic workplaces under the law, at least until recently. And so when we have an environment where someone is being treated poorly, the onus is on the organization to address that, and if they don't, then the organization is liable for that. So there are tremendous costs attached to dismissing, because there's always a risk that someone will sue because they feel like it's unfair or illegal discrimination. Or we don't dismiss them, and the same kind of problems on the other hand of on the other side of that coin, which is we're being negligent because we're allowing a poor performer or a harasser or someone who's engaged in illegal or unethical behavior still being there, someone who's abusive, someone who is disruptive to the flow of work in the company. So there's always pros and cons to both, but you have to look at long term, right? Do you want to have somebody working for you that is a poor performer? Do you want somebody who's working for you who is a toxic employee? It doesn't matter if they can bring in business. If they are creating a toxic environment where workers don't feel safe, then that's going to cost you money in the long run. So given that there's costs for keeping them on and costs that potentially could happen if we let somebody go, when do we make the decision to dismiss an employee? Well, we have to have an investigation, right? Was it a poor match? Was it a poor hire? Did we take a risk and it turned out to be a very poor risk that the person is not capable of doing the work that we expected? Is it a problem with disciplinary issues? And if it's a disciplinary issue, have we taken care of the process to make sure that we have a progressive disciplinary system? For example, if someone misbehaves, does something illegal, let's say, or they engage in sexual harassment, they get a verbal warning to start with. And then it might move up to a written warning. And if they do it again, then it could be a suspension without pay. And then ultimately, after we give them multiple chances, right, to fix the problem, and they choose not to fix it, then we have done everything in our power to try to remedy the situation, and ultimately the person is going to be let go. So that is obviously a concern for us. So if you are disciplining employees, you need to have what we call a progressive disciplinary procedure or a process by which you're going to have some sort of remediation. You don't just say to somebody, this is wrong, you've got a verbal warning. You now have to engage with them and to teach them the right way to do things. And so I've done some corrective coaching with people when someone is engaged in some poor behaviors. They have called me then to sit down with them and explain to them what they did wrong, talk about why they did it, and let's figure out a way to make sure this doesn't happen again. And so that corrective coaching is part of the progressive disciplinary process. And we want to make sure we're handling it right away when we have an issue like that. And we'll talk about this in the legal environment, but when there is a disciplinary problem, we don't wait to address it. We have to address it right away, because the longer we wait, the longer the delay is, the more people think, oh, nothing bad happened. Why should I care? I'm not worried about it. And then ultimately, the discipline falls short, right? So if we're going to discipline people, we have to do it as close to the event as possible. If there's poor performance, though, again, what were the hiring tools we used? Did we get a recommendation from somebody that was a poor recommendation? We need to figure out where the disconnect happened, right? So that we ensure that if we're going to hire somebody again to replace them, that we don't repeat the same mistakes. And I've worked on searches for positions where we had a poor hire, the first decision, and then without looking into the problems, they said, we're just going to use the same process we used before. And I'm like, but you already had a bad hire using that process. Why would you use the same process to assume you'll get a different result, because you're not going to get a different result. You're going to get the same result. So obviously, as Einstein says, insanity is when you keep doing the same thing expecting a different result, and that's the circumstance there. So it is important that we give people every opportunity, whether it's a performance-based issue or a disciplinary-based issue. We want to make sure that we have given them every opportunity to improve, to get training, to get interventions, and to get corrective training and put on a performance improvement plan. And if none of that works, then we let them go. So, when do we then decide when to do this? Well, again, we want to do it at a time when it seems to make sense with the progression of the problem, after we have exhausted all of our options, and then when when we're ready to make the decision. Obviously, we need to sit down. We need to have all our paperwork ready. We need to be able to have a very clear and straightforward communication. This employee should not be surprised, right? We should be tracking what they're doing and then making a decision, and they should be informed of those decisions every step of the way. There are some legal sides to dismissals that we need to be aware of. Now, most states are employment at will, which basically means I can let an employee go at any time for any reason, no questions asked. Like tomorrow, you could walk in the door and I could say, yeah, don't come back anymore, we're done. And you could have been a good employee, but I am legally allowed to do that. Now, right or wrong, again, whether we think that's the right thing to do or not is a separate issue. But legally, I can do that. There are some constraints to employment at will, however. Obviously, we cannot violate the law if, in fact, there is a legal reason. You're getting rid of somebody who is pregnant, for example. You cannot fire somebody who is pregnant just because they're pregnant. And so we want to be careful, because in many of these situations, even if you're saying I'm letting them go because I don't want them here anymore and they're a poor performer, if it gives the impression that there might be a dismissal because of any kind of legal issues, if there's any ambiguity in that, we want to tread very carefully, and obviously we want to speak with an attorney before we make a final decision whether or not to let somebody go. But there's a couple of really solid reasons why it would be considered wrongful dismissal if we got rid of somebody. And one would be if there's a collective bargaining agreement or a solid contract that says this person is hired, these are the conditions under which they're hired, and they can't be let go unless we follow the conditions under that contract. So any kind of contract, whether it's a written contract or an implied contract. For example, if the employee handbook says good performers will always have a job here, and you might say, well, layoffs can happen. Sure, but when your manual, which has the force of a contract, says good performers will always have a job, if you have a good performer and you're laying them off, then you're violating that statement. And so the courts have found that statements in your employee manual can be construed as a contract, so we want to be careful of that. Obviously, many employees have an explicit contract that says this is the terms for your job, and these are the conditions under which you will be employed, et cetera, et cetera. And if we don't follow that contract, that's a problem for us. Not only are there federal laws that we need to be wary of in terms of federal and state laws that we're following. We don't want to fire somebody because they are, if they're protected under employment law. If we are engaging in malicious behavior, in bad faith. For example, somebody is a week away from being able to retire with full vestment in their pension, and we let them go like the day before and say it's effective this date and you no longer will get your pension. That is malicious intent, and often the courts will argue that the timing was bad and that we should have made a decision significantly sooner if we didn't want them to be on board, or Um, we should have waited till after the full vestment into their pension plan to let them go then, and then they would get their full pension. And also if there are public policy interests, so there's a whole host of constraints to employment at will. So it is not as free will as you might think it is. But as long as we are arguing that there's really there's no good reason necessarily to fire somebody. There's no apparent reason or perceived reason why somebody would be discriminated against. If I decide tomorrow to let somebody go, I can let them go. But the opposite is also true. Like, you can quit for any reason at any time, no questions asked. Employment at will it goes in both directions. So I don't have to give a reason if I choose to leave, and I don't have to give notice if I choose to leave. Now, is that courtesy? Of course. It is courtesy to give a 2-week notice. Often employers will just say, no, you can go now, we'll pay you the 2 weeks. But there is obviously rights that the employee has that says, no, we want to make sure that the person who is engaging in work for us, if they choose to leave, I have no choice in the matter. I can't control that at all, and they are allowed to go at their own in their own way.